Hey, what's up, folks? How are you? It took me all day to kind of really analyze what this video was going to be about. And I was asked a lot about Diego Maradona a lot. And, it's kind of weird to analyze him because he ends up being such a complex individual. He ends up being this figure where he ends up being the hero and the villain and the martyr. And it's weird to kind of start looking at it. At one point, in order to kind of comprehend what he meant, what he was, what he ended up being, you kind of have to compartmentalize. And the biggest lesson that I learned, and the person that taught me that lesson, ended up being his trainer. I interviewed him once, Fernando Signorini, and he had a great quote about him. He told me, "For Diego, I'd fight and go around the world. With Maradona, I wouldn't even cross the street or go two steps." Kind of paraphrasing what he basically said, and it makes sense what he said because you have Diego, you have El Diego, you have Maradona, you have a kid that came out of abject poverty was affluent for him. So you understand where he came from. I mean, he had no floor. There was no floor in his house. His the inside of his house was the outside of his house. It was dirt. He was the definition of dirt poor. But he was able to make something of what he had with a God-given talent. And there were a lot of adversities that he had to overcome, everything from being from a low social class to becoming a figure of Argentine culture, and some even look at him as a symbol of the poor. Maybe that's a little bit of a stretch for me because part of my life I saw him talking about communism from a castle in from basically a castle in the Middle East. So there was this dissonance at a certain point, but that's also him. But also the poor kid was also him. And also the kid that was kind of being moved along. I mean, the kid that went and spent his first paycheck on pizza with his mother, his first professional paycheck, he ends up going with his mother to a pizza place or by his house to go and enjoy that moment with her. That's also him. And you kind of have to compartmentalize him based on different things, because at the same time you hear a lot of people talk very derogatory and negative things about him. The people that were closest to him, every single one had something positive to say. Footballers from all over the world had something positive to say about him. So he ends up being something of a little bit of all of us, because we're not all evil, we're not all good. We have our good things, we have our bad things. The thing is that his bad things and his good things were basically there for everyone to see. The problems that he had, the pain that he suffered, because it wasn't that he was a drug addict. I mean, he dealt with a lot of physical pain through his life. The ankle injury that he suffered, courtesy of Andoni Goicoechea breaking his ankle, was something that he endured for many years. I mean, the infiltrations that he suffered while he was at Napoli having to play. I mean, it kind of helped him get through. Many others, many others would have not been able to endure what he endured. At the same time, we end up looking at how he passed away at 60 years of age, and it was like he was 190 in terms of life. And not only that, it seemed like he lived 10 lifetimes in 60 years, because he was a little bit of everything. He was a footballer, he was a icon of culture, he was a rebel, he was all about the free market, and he was all about communism, and he was all about the poor, and he was all about the rich, and he was all about fighting for the underdog and sometimes being the underdog and sometimes fighting the powers that be at FIFA and then becoming part of FIFA at one point or another in I guess more of an effort to kind of silence him. There's all these things that come through, but it's this kid from Fiorito that he wasn't him getting to where he got was a miracle. Him getting to Argentinos was a miracle. So understand the odds that he had to go just to make that first step. That's what makes his story so unbelievable. And of course, everything else ends up being just astronomically incredible. He talked about at one point how his legs were shaking at the San Paolo. Keep in mind that he ends up saying no to Milan. I mean, he has Berlusconi. How much do you want? How much do you want? Open checkbook, what a blank check, come for whatever. Fill it out. You put the number. We're good. Says no. He goes to Corrado Ferraini over in Napoli, a team that barely anyone knew. That everyone that represented the South, they were looked at as quote unquote the Africans. That were looked at as subhuman within Italy, and I tell you this from an experience personally. Okay, I there and I highly recommend you do it. If you ever have a chance to go to Naples, go. There were few things in my life that got me so emotional. And mind you, I never was this huge Maradona fan or whatever. I never was. I do respect what he's done. I do respect what he meant. I do respect that legacy. But very few times will you be you'll be in awe of the love that a city has for a person ever until you go to Naples. You go to the Spanish Quarter, you walk around, it's just it just looks like the buildings are falling apart, ruins, and then all of a sudden you see this big, huge mural of Maradona and people just going around and people singing and praising him and constantly. That changes you in terms of who he was and what he meant to people. That in and of itself is something that just blows your mind in terms of how people are. You see murals of him everywhere. You see little figurines of him. You see his face splattered all over that neighborhood. You see him, you feel his presence to a certain extent in Naples. And I was talking to someone in terms of what that really meant. As an outsider, I never really was understanding of that until I sat down with someone from Neapolitan there, and he said, um, he gave us a sense of belonging. He gave us a sense of really having a sense of worth being from the south of Italy. We were proud to be Napolitani. We were proud to be what we are, what we've always been. He explained basically that, and you start reading a lot of interviews that were done by journalists, said, look, Diego was able to offer us an identity that we weren't ashamed of, that we became, it was a badge of honor to be looked down upon by the people in the North. And he made us proud of what we were. And that more than the Scudetti that he was able to win, than the UEFA Cup, than everything else that he was able to do at Napoli, it was that no longer were they looked at as subhuman, that they were indeed a very special people. And when you go to Naples, and I went to various cities in Italy, and never did I feel more loved and more appreciated than I did in Naples. And it's a beautiful, I mean, in its chaotic nature, and that was Diego. And Napoli was Diego. I mean, you go there and you see the chaos and the complete almost anarchical state of traffic and how people drive around and how people yell at each other, and you don't know if they're fighting or they're affectionate towards one another. But that was him in a nutshell, and he fit in perfectly. And many of us in South America, we fit in perfectly with Napoli as well. And he was that. He was that also. He was the guy that was cursing out the Italians when when they were whistling his national anthem in the 1990 World Cup. He was also the one that suffered a lot at the expense of the identity of others. Argentines also suffered a great deal after the Falkland Islands, the Malvinas War, and he gave them that identity again, or at least something to feel proud about in a moment where morale wasn't at its highest in its country. And he gave them that sense of pride. So it wasn't just the football, and it was a lot the football. I mean, a guy that Gary Lineker even explained it once what he was able to do with the football, just kick it straight up in the air and do it 13 times, while every other average player, average I say, of course, compared to him at that time, could only do three. People asked him for things, he gave, and he was generous about it. Those are things people don't often hear until you hear it from the people themselves. Uh, Maybe he wasn't a saint of my devotion, and he wasn't someone that I really looked up to. No, not at all. Because of course, as I grew up, I saw a different light. I saw a player that, or a person that was, big headed and although I loved his quotes, I still love his quotes. I love his phrases, how quick he was, how quick witted he was. So much so that it got him a TV show. So much so that he also became a TV host. So much so that he wanted to become a boxer. And yeah, boxed a couple of exhibition matches. That was way before Jake and Logan Paul were doing anything in boxing. He did those types of things. He understood what he was, but also he didn't understand what he had to be. Because a lot of times when you end up giving so much to the world, you end up losing everything to yourself. And if something really suffered, it was his personal life, because he wanted to be full. He wanted to be fulfilled. And at times it just didn't seem that way because he needed to be fulfilled through others, through other things. His personal life suffered a great deal because of that. And it's kind of sad that a person with so many friends, so many admirers, so many fans, so many people that idolized him ended up dying alone, all alone. And that to me ends up being the tragedy of him. I could talk about the glory as well, the glorious moments at Napoli, the glorious moments with Argentina, the glorious moments in his life, the comical moments where, of course, he ends up getting in a fight with Enzo Ferrari over a black Ferrari. Enzo Ferrari, wow, a black Ferrari, that doesn't exist. And surely enough, the famous black Ferrari that you see in many pictures, that's that one. And then he complained as soon as he got that black Ferrari, he says to his agent that back then, Guillermo Coppola, says, "This car doesn't have a stereo." And he's like, "Diego, it's not supposed to have a stereo. It's a high performance car." That was him in a nutshell as well. Then, of course, he had the people around him that didn't guide him in the best path, that put him in negative situations in Cuba, that put him in bad situations where he almost lost his life at one point because he had a drug overdose. He would he'd jump on and fall off the wagon many times over. And he knew it. And he knew that his life was a disaster, and he tried to do something about it and he couldn't. And sometimes his demons were the ones that impeded him from doing so. Is it to blame him? No, but yes. And no, but yeah, at the end, because you can control certain situations. Now, who am I to say that now for a man that's already been passed away 4 years? He has no way to defend himself. And then, of course, you see the one just days and weeks before he dies where they're just propping him out there onto a pitch and he has no idea where he's at. He's walking around dumbfounded because he's so drugged up, not because of his own will, because of him having to be able to be drugged up in order to be able to walk. That too ends up being a tragedy as well. Because many would have been able to appreciate him more. Many would have been able, or would have wanted to do more. Of course, keep in mind that during that time he was also in pain. Remember, he had already had two knee replacements, and it took him a longer than he should have waited in order to have those knee replacements. So there's a lot to delve into when it comes to a figure that ends up being still one of the more controversial ones in football, one of the more intriguing ones in the world of football. You might like him, you might not, and that's fine because, as a colleague of mine said, hey, look, to this day, not everybody loves Jesus Christ. What would make you think that you have to, they'd have to like you, or they'd have to like anyone else for that matter? And he's right. There'll be a lot of people that will be detractors of him, and that's fine, and that's valid, and they'll have their points. But at the end of the day, well, you also have to try and find a positive, and maybe that's a lesson for all of us, including myself.